Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlie Collins, and I would like to welcome everybody to the East Hampton Library for the Twomey lecture series today on All About Oysters. Just to introduce our guests quick, the first one is Barley Dunne. Barley is the director of the East Hampton Town Shellfish Hatchery. Barley has studied oysters his entire professional career, starting in the Peace Corps in the Solomon Islands to today, where he is the director of the Hatchery since 2011. He has a master's degree in fisheries and aquaculture from Auburn University. And our next guest is Adam Muniz. Adam is the bay management specialist at the East Hampton Town Shellfish Hatchery and the owner/operator of Promised Land Shellfish, producer of Lazy Point oysters. Originally from Texas, Adam holds a master's in marine science from Stony Brook University. He has worked at the town hatchery since 2015. And our moderator for this evening is Sara Davison. Sara is the president of the East Hampton Library and executive director of the Friends of Georgia Capon Foundation. Just want to make sure everybody knows that after the lecture is over, please join us in the courtyard upstairs for some oysters and complimentary beer from the Montauk Brewing Company.
I've been fishing my whole life. I've been fishing for a living, working my hands and bleeding on the decks of all the boats here and up in Northport where I was born since I was 8 years old. Now I am actually making a living and giving back to the bay that supported me for 40 years. I started out clamming, moved into harvesting oysters from the wild. Predominantly all winter long we are harvesting to market the final product, and we're building new equipment or restoring old equipment. Just like the oysters have cycles throughout the year, we follow those cycles. So coming out of the winter, we'll be raising the submerged oysters, which are submerged in cages. We'll be raising those cages and we'll be transferring the oysters from cage bags, which don't have floats on them, into floating bags to bring them up to the surface for the surface season. So we tumble the oysters several times a year. The oysters are dumped onto a table, seaweed and macroalgae pulled out from the pile. They're rinsed and pushed through the machine that grades them to size, turns them against one another, and then they're rebagged and planted again. As they grow, they take up more space in the bag, and so when you start out, you might have 1,000 baby oysters in a bag. If you just left them alone, you'd have 100 survivors at the end of the year. But when you empty it out as they grow, and just put 2 gallons into a 6-gallon bag, then the oysters have the space to get their food and not compete with one another, and they can grow and stay clean. So the idea is to keep the density at a manageable level, which we really should take some lessons from on that end, if you ask me. So we do our best to help create the best environment for the oyster, meaning only simply to keep a direct access to the natural things that an oyster would in the wild. The whole idea of this surface grow-out system is to keep the oysters up on the surface for a couple of different reasons. One being that the nutrient level is a little bit richer. There's also different nutrients up on the surface of the water. Right where the strongest low tide interacts with the tidal wetlands, that's a primo spot for shellfish. And the reason is, that's where the surface water is interacting most with the bottom. You're looking at out here is the remnants of our surface grow-out system, which is our nursery area. The floating bags house our youngest oysters. We normally have 4,500 bags floating on the surface of the water like a vineyard of the sea. They're arranged with auger anchors, 320 feet long with an anchor in the middle. Our work schedule is year-round. We are in the water in February. There's icebergs. We're still in the water. We wear a 6mm wetsuit with rain gear over it, and we can get in the water and get things done. Throughout our farm, we're walking. It's high tide right now, so we'll be walking in water this deep. It's considered unnavigable waters. The reason why we were able to get this approved here, it's so shallow, boats were running aground. I feel that now that I have a foothold in shellfish aquaculture, and knowing that the East End is a prime location for shellfish aquaculture, I would be honored to be able to carry it forward a notch. I'd like to start a shellfish aquaculture program in the town where commercial guys like me could go and set up a farm and actually give back to the bay and respect the bay. I'd like to work with kids and adults and take them out, show them what we do and how we do it. And I also have some really good ideas for expanding aquaculture on a level that would provide a lot of protein for the life force right here from Montauk.
Farming is hard work, and we are so fortunate in this town to have a shellfish hatchery. Not every town has one, and Barley does a magnificent job of running the hatchery, and Adam works with him and has his own side business of oyster farming. So Barley, why don't you just take a minute and tell us about the town hatchery and what you do and what your mission is.
Hi, good evening. So the East Hampton Town Shellfish Hatchery was started back in the 80s by my predecessor, John Aldred. And it was in response to the brown tide. I'm sure most of you heard about the brown tide, which swept through really the whole East Coast and wiped out a lot of the shellfish populations and the eelgrass populations. So a lot of hatcheries sprung up to try and help to restock the populations of shellfish that were lost.
Is anybody sitting here?
So since the late 80s, we've been in operation. We have a hatchery in Montauk and a nursery on 3 Mile Harbor, and we have a field grow-out site in Napeague Harbor. So we grow oysters, clams, and scallops every year. We started the hatchery in January, getting the oysters ready to spawn. Start spawning in February, and we're getting a jump start on the season, sort of like your land nurseries do by starting seed in the nursery. We start indoors and get healthy crop going. This time of the year, we're wrapping up the season, and we're starting to seed our shellfish. Our oysters are around average of about 2 inches from this year's crop. Clams are the size of a dime or a nickel or so, and scallops are the size of about a silver dollar. So every season, every year, we go through this cycle. We grow the crop of a few million oysters, several million clams, and a few 100,000 scallops. Seed those all throughout town, and just repeat the process each year. The purpose is to try and keep the culture of shellfishing alive on the East End, as well as these shellfish have a huge water quality component where they're filter feeders, so they're constantly filtering water, providing habitat, and they're part of the solution in keeping our waters as beautiful as they are.
Great. Is that what you think Mike is saying when he's giving back to the bay?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is one industry where you actually you provide benefit to the environment, whereas other industries, we need to provide food. The beauty of growing shellfish, these filter feeders, is that there's no inputs into the farm. The farm that you saw on the screen there, there's nothing being added aside from the gear and the oysters themselves, and they just feed on the ambient algae that's available. So that's part of the giving back.
So Adam, I understand that this is the first year Lazy Point oysters have come to market. Congratulations. Tell us a little bit about your struggle and hard work to get an oyster farm going.
So there's, I guess, it starts with just kind of going through the permitting process once you've determined that you actually want to do an oyster farm. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's, so once you go through the permitting process, which takes about a year, and you're purchasing gear in the meantime and kind of getting ready, I think one obstacle that I ran into with my farm was what is described in our industry as NIMBY, which is not in my backyard. And so there were private entities near my farm that didn't want me there. So that was kind of my first hurdle, was dealing with that. And then after that, it's just, it's Mother Nature, and just staying on top of the maintenance schedule and making sure that the oysters have a clean, healthy place to grow.
So let's dive right into the commercial industry and the use conflicts in the bays, not in my back bay, right? Because there's been a few in town, and the pictures of Mike's cages were very clear that it can take a sizable amount of space, and I guess he said he got his because it was so shallow that it was not navigable.
Mm-hmm.
So was your underwater land in a navigable area?
According to the Coast Guard, it's depending, they have different definitions of how they, but it's I guess it's navigable up to a certain extent, but it's also usable for aquaculture.
Right,
so
right.
Both can exist.
So both can exist. I mean, there's a long tradition of harvesting seafood out here, and of course a huge tradition of tourism and the beauty of the bays. And how do we reconcile, a working waterfront with recreational use of the waterfront? It's an interesting question. You go to states like Maine, you see, huge not industrial, but commercial use of the waterfront. What's your vision for our waterfront here in terms of balancing oyster farming and recreation?
That's a very difficult question. As I'm just now getting into it's hard to decipher what will happen in the future, but I think as long as everybody keeps cool heads and the aquaculture community is, we do this type of work because we love the water. not just because we're trying to get rich, which we're not. And so it's in our nature to take care of the bay. And I think that can also coexist with recreational uses. It has to.
Barley, your thoughts on that?
Can you tell us where
We're
your
good.
barn is?
Yes, it's in Gardiner's Bay. So
We'll take questions at the end, okay? Thanks.
Yeah, I concur with Adam in that there needs to be some compromise and some sharing. You know, when the Suffolk County Aquaculture Lease Program first was established way back in 2009 or so, they might have made a little bit of a mistake by drawing a map which showed really the majority of the conch in Gardiner's Bays as being available for aquaculture. And it kind of shocked some people and made them think that, oh no, the whole system's going to be overcome with farms. But the reality is that they've only allocated less than 1% of the entire area from Flanders to Napeed for aquaculture. So there's plenty, there's never going to be a monopoly of the bays for aquaculture. It's a very, very small percentage of the bay. And just to put it in perspective, some of the other successful states like Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine, they figure about 5% of their water bodies can be allotted to aquaculture, and it's still kind of a fair balance.
That sounds pretty fair. I think it's so interesting to see the cages and the activity. I think, it is, in Maine, I know it is a tourist draw to go look at the shipbuilding and the commercial docks. It's quite interesting. So let's drill down a little bit on the water purifying role, the ecological role of the oyster. I know you at the hatchery, you have these huge tubs of oysters, but you have even more huge tubs of algae, yellow and green giant vats of stuff growing, which is the food of the oyster, right? So, and I know the oyster opens its shell and somehow water goes in and then somehow it spits the water out. But tell us exactly what's going on there and how it sequesters nitrogen and eats the algae and purifies.
Sure. So I have an oyster shell here to kind of try and put things into perspective. So this is the bottom valve. So if the oyster were whole, there'd be another shell on top here, right? So that's the oyster. So this is the way the oyster would sit on the bottom. So they have an in-current side and an ex-current side. So on this side, if it were alive, there would be gills and a mantle, and they're taking their water in, taking the water in. And oysters can actually move the water. They're not entirely passive. They can kind of pump the water to take the water in and feed off of it. So they'll take that water in, and they actually use their gills and their mantle to move it down to their mouth parts. And they have an amazing selective ability. Because you can imagine in the water, there's phytoplankton, there's zooplankton, there's a little bit of dirt, for lack of a better word, and they'll actually select through all that. And the stuff that they don't want, they excrete as what we call pseudofeces. And the stuff that they want, they'll take into their mouth and they'll digest it and then poop it out. So an adult oyster, like this oyster, can pump around about 30 gallons of water a day. So extrapolate that out to the millions of oysters that we seed each year and the millions of oysters that are out there surviving. That's a lot of water quality coming out of the oyster. The clam can filter about half of that, scallop about half, also about half. So and that's really why it's a good land example is the trees. We know that trees purify air, right? And we would never even think about wiping the trees off the earth because we know that we need them for the air. We just saw this issue down the Amazon where much of the Amazon was burning, the lungs of the earth. So the trees are the lungs of our air, and the shellfish are the lungs of the waterways.
So we're dealing with pseudofeces and feces?
The real thing and the fake thing.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm almost there. So, right. So, but the algae, the phytoplankton, is their food. That's what they get their nutrients from and grow from. And how do they sequester nitrogen?
There's nitrogen also embodied in the food. And so they'll, just like we're taking nutrients out of our food to build our muscles and bones and everything else, they're doing the same thing, and they're sequestering the nitrogen into both their meats and their shell. So that when you remove the oyster from the waterway, you're removing the nitrogen that it's sequestered.
And of course, I ask about the nitrogen because it's such an issue in our surface waters and groundwater today that anything that can remove nitrogen or bacteria or phytoplankton is so that's how it's purifying the water. And the gallons, the amount that oysters can process is just staggering. I read a statistic that in New York Harbor, in the old days, there were enough oysters to process all the water in New York Harbor before the big harvesting started. Okay, so that's good. Now, they're sequestering these elements and nutrients. So, do you feel it's safe to eat raw oysters, Adam?
Yes, most definitely. I think one. So I think one not even misnomer, or when we talk about how oysters sequester nitrogen, I think there's one link that sometimes is forgotten, is that the algae is in order for algae to divide and prosper, they need nitrogen, just like we all need nitrogen. So it's actually the algae that's taking up this nitrogen and then splitting and doing that over and over again. And it's, the algae itself is taking that nitrogen and using it to make it itself, and then the oyster takes that. And so when we talk about excess nitrogen in the water, it's not that the oyster is sucking up nitrogen. No, it's sucking up the algae that took up the nitrogen. And I think that piece is sometimes missed.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the DEC, our New York State DEC, certifies our waters for shellfish. So do you have confidence in that program that the oysters that are being brought out of our waters are safe to eat?
Yes, I definitely do. They run a strict program, and I most definitely do.
Yeah, they have the public safety in mind, and it would reflect very poorly on them if someone were to harvest oysters from areas that they certified as safe and they got sick.
I graduated from Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Go Green Wave.
And the way you threw a party at Tulane is you rented a keg of beer and a sack of oysters. And that was the party. That's all you needed. And everyone came, and I only got sick once.
It wasn't
from
the
beer,
oysters, though.
All right, so we should all feel pretty comfortable and good about eating local, not Louisiana, eating local oysters. All right, so let's talk about the oyster itself again. It's one species, the eastern oyster, Chrysostria virginica, right? I think I said that right. And yet we have all these varieties. Now we have Lazy Point, we have Robbins Island, we have Blue Point, Chesapeake, you name it. What distinguishes the varieties and how are they developed to be different? Because when you look at them, they are quite different and they taste different.
Yeah, sure, I'll take that one. So on the east coast of the United States, we're working with the eastern oyster. There are different species that live on the west coast. But in our neck of the woods, what differentiates this one species is the body of water that it's grown in. So if something that is grown in, let's say, Napeague Harbor is going to taste different than 3 Mile Harbor, one of the reasons for that is just the minerals that are found in each one of these harbors. And so with different minerals, you're going to have a different taste to the oyster. There's also different populations of phytoplankton in different bodies of water, so that's going to give you a different taste as well. And in terms of the aesthetics of the oyster, whether the oyster is being grown in a high activity area, so lots of waves and wind and just physical motion, is going to change the way it looks if it was kind of grown somewhere where there's not a lot of wind in a, let's say, in a protected cove. And so an oyster grown where there's a lot of physical wave action is going to have a more rough, maybe even a little bit more heavy, and its muscle will also be a little bit stronger just because it's constantly being rocked. And so that very generally speaking, that is what differentiates oysters from Florida up to Maine. It's just what body of water.
Is anyone familiar with the word terroir? It's
Yes.
used.
There you go.
Yeah. So we have a word for the marine industry for oysters called merwa. It's based on the same concept. So you have grapes that are grown in different areas, same species that taste a little different based on the minerality of the soil. So same thing with oysters. We just call it merwa.
All right, so we've got the merwa and the different tastes, and but how is there a certain percent that's marketing here? I mean, is the Robbins Island oyster really that different from the Montauk Pearl?
There is definitely marketing involved, but you will find a taste difference as well. And I think, if you guys remember from the video, Mike Martin was tumbling his oysters. In the lake where he grows, there's not a lot of wave action, so that is an extremely important process for him in order to get a deep cup or bottom part or to the oyster. So, Tom's an expert. So, I lost my train of thought, but
Mike at the lake.
thank you. Yeah, so, which, with less wave action, your oyster is going to look different. And so there is some marketing involved. Of course, you want to differentiate your eastern oyster from somebody else's eastern oyster. But that comes out, it comes out with the product itself.
Okay, so thank you. That was very helpful. And on a trip to Maine, I did an oyster tasting of all these Maine oysters, and they all look different and they tasted different. And I hope we can have that here in the Peconics and Gardner system, a wonderful array someday of all of the wonderful oysters that you're growing. So, Barley, can you explain this whole month of R issue? Because you guys work year-round and you're working really hard, but we used to think we couldn't eat oysters that didn't have R in the month.
Okay, yeah, let's discuss the month with R thing. So, months with R, May, June, July, August, right? So they say that you're not supposed to eat oysters during those months. There's a few reasons. One is that those are the warm months, obviously. So there's a certain bacteria involved in all marine animals that comes into play there. So back in the day, say pre-refrigeration, you get Bayman, Bob, and Betty working the oyster grounds and pulling the oysters up onto their boat and just dumping them on the deck, leaving them there. Working all day. The sun's beating down on those oysters, and there's a certain bacteria called Vibrio, which is a ubiquitous bacteria that's in those oysters, and as the sun is beating down on them, it's just blooming, proliferating. And if you're immunocompromised or a little bit ill, and you eat some of those oysters with excess Vibrio in them, you might get sick. So nowadays, all this is known. Vibrio is quite well understood. We understand the effects, and keep the shellfish out of the sun. And there's regulations involved, and now all harvesters you've seen folks working in the bay, they have a basket floating behind them. That's one way to mitigate against the Vibrio, is keep them in the water, shade them, put them directly on ice, and voila, we have safe oysters not baking in the sun. So that's one reason. That's the predominant reason, really. But if your oysters are handled properly, kept out of the sun, put right on ice, shouldn't be a problem. The other reason is that during those warm months, they also tend to spawn. So usually around here, oysters will spawn.
I knew we'd get to sex.
Yeah, we got lots of sex talk. Usually around here, oysters spawn around middle of June. So once they spawn, they tend to be a little bit watery. Their meats are a little thin. They might not taste as good as they might taste in the spring or fall. Actually, one of the best times to eat oysters is during one of those no-R months, May, right? Because they're fattening up. It's springtime. The water temperature is about 60 degrees. It's starting to green. They're fattening up, getting ready to spawn. So they're plump and really tasty. May is one of the best times to eat oysters. And this time of year, from now to the end of the year, is a great time to eat oysters because they're getting ready for the winter. They're gathering up sugars, getting ready to hibernate for the winter. Great time to eat oysters. So there's no reason really not to eat them during those months with R. It might be a personal preference. You might not prefer the watery oyster. Or you might be concerned with taking oysters out of the water that might spawn and produce progeny. But it's really based on the Vibrio illness thing. So definitely don't, if you want oysters in July, go for it. It's not a problem.
No other food brings us closer to the sea, it's been said. So I hope you'll all enjoy the oysters upstairs. So finally, Casanova ate 50 oysters for breakfast. Romans listed them in their orgy menus. Lord Byron swore by them, and Napoleon as well. They have an ancient link between oysters and good sex and aphrodisiacal powers. Can we get to the bottom of this as well? Adam, you want to start?
Wife's here, be good.
I think they're just, I don't know. I think first of all, it's a personal thing, whether you eat an oyster and you get sensual or whatever. But I kind of had to look into this because I've always wondered myself how that connection was made. And I came across an article, it was published in 2005. It was a group of Italian researchers, chemists, and American chemists, and they wanted to know the same question: what is the deal here? And what this paper said was, without getting into too much detail, because I'm not a chemist, is that there are two amino acids that are, which are the building blocks of life, that are in high concentrations in the oysters when they are in fact ready to spawn. And so when we consume those oysters, with the test that they did, progesterone and testosterone levels increased in their patients, in their test subject. And so they kind of isolated it to these two particular amino acids that you don't usually find in other sources in nature. It's like, this is an oyster thing, the amino acids that they produce. So, that's kind of a boring answer. That's the science behind it, yeah. It's not fake news. What?
No effect on women? Yes.
No, the progesterone levels also went up.
Male and female hormones.
Yeah.
Well,
Estrogen, I'm sorry, I got mine.
Progesterone.
I'm sorry, yes.
estrogen.
Estrogen. Yes, ma'am, sorry.
Yeah, Barley, chime in.
I've also heard that since they're high in zinc, they attribute high zinc to lifting libido, and actually one of my veterinarian friends said it actually makes your sperm swim faster.
So there is some science to it, folks. So eat up, all right.
Never blows your hair back.
Barley, would you just say a word? You didn't mention it in your program, but a word about the community oystering garden program that you're doing, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, there's a few oyster gardeners here. I'm glad to see. So we have, yeah, raise your hand if you're an oyster gardener. What the heck? Wow.
Nice.
You're hiding. Awesome. So we have an oyster gardening program in town, which allows folks like these folks to grow 1,000 oysters at a time. We have 4 gardens. One's in 3 Mile Harbor, one's in Accabonac Harbor, one's in Hog Creek, one's in Napeague Harbor. So we have an educational program that starts in the winter out at the hatchery. We kind of go through our educational program kind of follows our season. So we start with the biology talk, and we'll go through spawning and how we grow the algae, how the nursery works, and then every year around about June, the participants get their batch of their own seed oysters. And they're allowed to grow 1,000 at a time. So usually what we do is we give about 900 little baby oysters, which are about 5/16 in length, and we give them a jump start by giving them about 100 one-year-old oysters, which will reach harvest size in the first year. So we kind of set a schedule, give guidance as to how to maintain their oysters, and as they reach harvest size, which because they're cultured, they actually don't have a harvest limit, so they can, if you prefer a petite oyster, you can take that home. So the idea is to get these folks out in the water, growing oysters, and taking oysters home to eat, giving them to their friends. 1,000 oysters is a lot of oysters. And,
They give half back.
yes, and they give. So the following season, if you want to continue your crop, give some back, and then you get a new crop of seed, and you just have a perpetual harvest to take home. So maybe if any of the gardeners want to add to their experience, that'd be great too.
Okay, well, let's get to that at questions then. You guys are doing a fantastic job. We really appreciate what you're doing for our town and our waters. Thank you for donating oysters to Georgia Pond. Georgia Pond appreciates it. They're doing very well. And now I think we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So I'm going to pass my mic down there, and just if you want to ask a question, or just speak into the mic, and Barley and Adam can answer, and then just pass the mic around.
Thank you. Our oceans are warming. Our oceans are becoming more acidified. How does that affect the oyster stocks, the growing of the oysters?
Yeah, sure. So with the warming of the oceans, I think it depends on where you're located to how much your oysters are going to be affected by warming oceans. I think one thing that it will do is actually increase the length of our growing season, which is kind of a positive. But it also may increase the length of time that a predator of oysters is able to live. And in terms of acidification, there was a recent article out of Australia, actually, that so it does. First of all, it does affect the shells of the oysters because they're made out of calcium carbonate, and a more acidic ocean is going to make for a more frail oyster, and it'll just be harder for the oyster itself to actually produce its shell. But there's research coming out that oysters are actually able to adapt to increasing ocean acidifications. It's not on huge concentration increases, but they're able from generation to generation to pass on what's called epigenetics to help the next generation deal with the changing environment over a course of one generation, 2 generations. But generally speaking, it's not a good thing if it continues at a quick rate. We will see effects on our farms.
So my favorite oyster meal is oysters Rockefeller. I'd like to know what your favorite method of preparation of oysters is. Question number 1. And question number 2, I have millions of oyster shells, and I'd like to know what to do with them, besides using them in my driveway. And do you have a favorite most creative usage of oyster shells that you could share with us?
So, first of all, we will take your oysters, right? The shells. Yeah. So we can coordinate that. I get a couple of questions in there. Oh, so raw is my favorite, for sure. Second to that is Rockefeller, for sure. And you had another question?
Usage of oyster shells.
Oh, usage. One thing we use the oyster shells for is we actually grind them up to create a very fine sand almost, and we use that to have the larval oysters as a place to set. So a larval oyster will set on one of those grains and start the metamorphosis.
We did have an oyster shell recycling program last year. Susan Perock-Heber's here. She helped us with that along with John Aldred, and we can use it in the hatchery along with what Adam said. We can grind them up into small pieces, so we end up with an individual oyster, or we can keep them whole and set a bunch of oysters on one shell, and that's what, say, Billion Oyster Project does. If Pete was here, he could speak to that. But it's a really good way to restore oyster reefs or to stabilize shorelines, kind of bunch them all together, because what you end up with is a big clump of oysters as opposed to just this single oyster. So we can take those oyster shells, put them in bags, set oysters on them in the hatchery in the lab setting, and as the oysters grow, they kind of grow together and solidify almost, if you will. And again, that's another thing that creates amazing habitat. We're growing some now for the Governor's Shellfish Project initiative, and we had some growing off of the bulkhead in 3 Mile Harbor, and those oyster bags were just teeming with grass shrimp and nursery fish, even eels swimming in and out of them. So just like any place else, you provide habitat where there otherwise isn't any, and things will come. But we hope to continue the oyster shell recycling program next year, so we'll hopefully get the word out to you as to where to bring them.
Sara and Barley and Adam, thanks so much for coming this evening. I am an oyster farmer, and my oyster farm is in Nepegue, my crate. And I wanted to ask you about the educational aspect of this, because I am on the committee for education, and I think it's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for children as well as adults to come down to the Shellfish Hatchery. And one of the things that we're going to be doing next week, if you could talk about that for the children in school, I think it's a great opportunity for everybody in this room, and if you have children or grandchildren, to get involved with the Shellfish Hatchery. I've learned so much, and I just want to address the educational aspect and have you talk about that to our audience, to your audience.
Yeah, thanks. We do offer tours at the whatever stage we are in during the season. We have school groups that come out to the hatchery during the school season, and they can check out our growing algae, and we always have something to show them under the microscope, whether it's algae or a larval oyster or clam. We do tours at the nursery with Project Most. The nursery's up on 3 Mile Harbor, and that's all land-based stuff. And then during the fall, we can do tours at the field site in Napeague Harbor, which incorporates a boat ride, which is always fun. And next week, like Susan said, we're doing a seeding event with Surf Rider, where the kids are going to meet us at Northwest Creek one afternoon. We're going to bring a whole bunch of oysters. They're going to paddle around on paddle boards and seed the oysters on the bottom in one of our seeding spots. So yeah, we're part of our mission is to get kids in and show them around. And it's amazing how you kind of think at the hatchery stage, you kind of think that things are kind of abstract, but even the kids really seem to get a lot out of it. And especially, it's even better if they can come later in the season and see the more tangible, larger oysters and clams. It really kind of puts everything into perspective.
Yeah, if you've never seen a larval shellfish, clam, or oyster, it's really cool to see it under a microscope, because it does not look anything like its adult phase.
I just wondered how this was all funded. How is this funded?
How is the town hatchery funded?
Way back in the beginning, back in the 80s, Mario Cuomo gave the hatchery a grant. It was about $168,000 to renovate the building that we're in now, which is an old Navy building. Really interesting building, huge, and we've made the best of it by building a hatchery inside this building. So originally, that grant was given to us, and we paid it back with Shellfish, actually. For 25 years, we gave the state 10% of our production. That was a payback, not a bad deal. And now we're generally funded by the town, so we're a town department. We're in the town budget, and we also get grants occasionally when they're available. So that's the crux of it.
Barley, how many oyster farmers do you have? How many did you start with? What's
Yeah, good one. So we started in 2016 with 15 gardeners, and now these guys started. Who else was there the first year? Yeah, William. With 15 gardeners at 3 Mile Harbor, and now we have the 4 sites, and we're up to about 100. And we have a few people that actually, it's a good point. If you actually have a dock in certified waters, you can grow oysters off your own dock. So get in touch with me, and we'll get you set up. It's a really awesome opportunity. I mean, what's better? Oysters floating off your dock.
I got one quick question. During this growing season, is there a time when there's a big algal bloom and the regulatory agencies call you up and say, hey, we've got an issue, and do you ever have to address things like that?
We are very lucky in that we've never had algae bloom issues because our field grow-out site, during the season where algae blooms are a problem, the majority of our crop is out in Napeague. And Napeague Harbor, I would never say never, but I want to say never in my time has had a harmful algae bloom. We do have the occasional red tide in 3 Mile Harbor, and we just try to keep tabs on the news, and never actually got a phone call. But you know, like many people, and anybody who's into shellfishing, you should sign up for the DEC newsletters, and they'll shoot you an email if there's ever a closure. But we knock on wood, since the brown tide, have never really had an issue with harmful algae because our water quality is so good out here, and also because a lot of our waters, since we're out on the East End, we have this oceanic influence, which helps with keeping our waters clean.
You had mentioned earlier the predators of oysters. Who are the predators?
So we are the predators. Then there are, you know, so it differs as they get older. So when they're kind of swimming in the water column as larvae, that is, their predator is going to be any fish that can see it and just kind of eat it. And then after that, one of the main predators is actually called an oyster drill, and it's a snail, and they will basically come onto your oyster and start drilling a hole and eat it from the outside. Yeah.
Blue crabs.
Tons of crab, yeah, blue crabs, tautog, conch.
Oyster catcher, which is a bird called an oyster catcher.
Yeah.
Starfish. What's that?
Starfish.
Starfish. Yeah, and I want to tell an interesting story that I don't know if anybody knows Kim Tatro. He works for Cornell. He's the guy that actually started the oyster gardening program in the East End. He always tells a story. It's a very funny story, and it argues for understanding animal biology. So way back in the day, when fishermen were pulling up these starfish in their nets, one of the things they had on their boat, aside from their nets and maybe a couple hooks, was a machete. So they'd be pulling up these nets, and they're just laden with starfish, doing all kinds of damage. So they put that starfish down and start hacking it up in little pieces. So who knows what happens when you do that? Regenerate. So once they figured out, oh, that's not such a great idea, they stopped doing that, and then they actually used mops, huge mops, and just scraped the bottom, and you know the little spines on the back of starfish, literally mopped them up off the bottom, and that's part of the reason why you really don't see many starfish out here. They are a big predator, and they just put their starfish legs around a clam or an oyster and just slowly, with slow, light pressure, just pry it open and then eat it up.
And where is your farm, number one, and then talk to me about Northwest Creek.
So my farm is located in Napeague Bay or Gardiner's Bay. It's the southern portion of Gardiner's Bay, kind of off of, if you guys are familiar with the fish farm, it's in that vicinity.
Oh, okay. Northwest Creek.
So Northwest Creek is the easternmost East Hampton creek or harbor of East Hampton jurisdiction. So that's the easternmost creek that we seed shellfish in. It's mostly seasonally open to shellfish.
Seasonally what?
Pardon?
Western.
Did I say? Yeah, I'm sorry. Western. So yes, it's the westernmost East Hampton water body, and it's only seasonally open to shellfish, so you can't go in there in the middle of summer. You have to wait till the cold season. But we seed oysters on the flat and some clams on the west side. The west side.
What month would that open up then?
Pardon?
What month would that be opening up?
Usually, I have to double check, but it's usually November 1st through end of March. You have to be a little bit hardy, but like I said before, it's a really great time of year to eat shellfish. It's a beautiful spot, too.
Is it common for the oysters to suck in like crabs in the shell itself? I bought oysters once and shucking them. There was little small, tiny crabs in them. I thought there was something wrong with them, but it was fine.
No, so that is the pea crab, right? It is a. It's not. It's fine for you to eat that oyster with a pea crab in there. They're not ideal, I don't believe, for the oysters. Is that correct?
Now, we used to think they were kind of commensal, sort of like the those birds on the oxpeckers on the ungulates that they clean them. But now we're recently really discovering that they're kind of a pest, as you can imagine. Little crab crawling around there. There's not a whole lot of space. You see them pretty often in scallops, and it's a regional thing. There's some areas that are just loaded with them. I haven't seen them a whole lot around here, but there's definitely pockets, and I've seen them in scallops and the peconics. And you can eat them.
Okay.
If you accidentally do, it's kind of like popcorn, I imagine.
I actually have a couple of questions. Nobody's mentioned pearls. Don't pearls come from oysters, or don't oysters do something
So
to
glad
pearls?
for once I brought props for that question. So maybe this can help answer your question. The one on the bottom is an actual pearl oyster. This is a black lip pearl oyster from the Solomon Islands. And this is an eastern oyster. So what's the main difference? The interior. So this stuff here, the interior coating is called the nacre. On this one, it's really beautiful. If you catch it in the light, there's kind of an iridescence. So that's what makes the pearl. When a foreign body gets in there, a lot of people say sand. It's really not often sand. It can actually be that pea crab, or maybe that pea crab lost a leg. And kind of like how we scar over, the oyster will scar over with the nacre, thus building a pearl. So you can imagine a pearl out of this stuff is really beautiful. I mean, it's amazing. Out of this, not so much. So these guys can make pearls. I mean, those that have shucked a lot of oysters, even clams. Just this year, actually, I saw 2 really beautiful clam pearls that were purple, the clam wampum. And they were round, and one of them was the size of a pea, and the other one was about maybe half the size of a pea. So you can get them, and those will actually be worth some money. And they're definitely worth mounting and wearing. But, so the short answer is, it all comes down to the nacre. So a pearl out of this stuff is, I mean, might as well mount up a piece of chalk. It looks the same. But a pearl out of this is just pure beauty.
I did have a second question, which was silly, but nobody's mentioned, well, does size matter?
With, the
You know,
size-
you order oysters and you get little petite ones and then you get big ones on the same plate.
You know, I think it's a personal preference. I know with my oysters, they do taste different when they're smaller compared to when they're larger. You know, and if you're an oyster gardener, you get to choose when you bring them home. If you like the smaller tasting ones, but it is a personal preference, really.
Okay, well, great questions from the audience. Thank you so much. We'll go upstairs and enjoy some real oysters.